They say he died for a country that didn't exist yet. A scene of such calculated theatrical cruelty designed not just to kill a man, but to extinguish an idea. On August 23, 1305, a vast crowd gathered in London, hungry for the death of the man they called the Devil of Scotland, William Wallace. Stripped naked, dragged for miles behind a horse, he was hauled onto a scaffold and offered a chance to confess his treason. He refused. His only crime, he maintained, was to love his country and fight for its freedom. The sentence was a litany of horrors: to be hanged, but cut down while still breathing, to be emasculated, his entrails torn from his living body and burned before his eyes, his heart carved from his chest, and finally, his head severed and his body quartered. This ritualistic execution was a brutal message from King Edward I of England to anyone who dared defy him. Yet, as the torturers began their work, something happened that Edward never anticipated. In that crucible of pain, a man was transformed into a legend. His final screams were not for mercy, but for freedom. And in that moment, the idea Edward tried to kill was rendered immortal. This is the story of William Wallace, but not the one you know from Hollywood. It's the story of a man who died for a country that didn't truly exist yet, whose ghost would shape a nation's destiny for 700 years. It's a story of love, betrayal, unimaginable courage, and the birth of a dream that refused to die. To understand the firestorm that was William Wallace, you must first understand the world that created him. A late 13th century Scotland, teetering on the edge of a precipice. For years, the kingdom had enjoyed a period of relative peace and prosperity under its king Alexander III. He was a capable ruler who had successfully kept his powerful and ambitious southern neighbor, King Edward I of England, at bay. Scotland was a sovereign nation, with its own laws, its own church, and its own distinct identity. But fate is a fragile thing. On a dark and stormy night in 1286, King Alexander was riding to be with his young queen when his horse stumbled in the darkness, throwing him over a sea cliff to his death. The tragedy was absolute. Alexander's children had all died before him. The sole heir to the Scottish throne was his 3-year-old granddaughter, a little girl living in Norway, known to history as Margaret, the Maid of Norway. Suddenly Scotland was adrift. A council of guardians was appointed to rule in her name, but everyone knew this was a temporary solution. The most powerful man in the British Isles, Edward I of England, saw his opportunity. Edward was a formidable figure, tall, imposing, a brilliant military strategist, and a ruthless legalist. He was known as Longshanks for his height, and would later be dubbed the Hammer of the Scots for his brutality. He proposed a marriage between his own son and the young Margaret. This would, in theory, unite the crowns of Scotland and England peacefully, creating a single powerful kingdom under his family's control. The Scottish nobles, fearing a civil war among themselves over the empty throne, reluctantly agreed. The Treaty of Bergen was signed, promising to preserve Scotland's laws and liberties, but the country held its breath. The worst was yet to come. In 1290, the young queen, not yet 8 years old, was sent by ship from Norway to claim her kingdom. She fell ill on the voyage and died in the Orkney Islands before ever setting foot on Scottish soil. The line of kings was broken. Scotland was left kingless and vulnerable. This was the moment Edward had been waiting for. With the direct line of succession extinguished, 13 different claimants to the Scottish throne came forward, each with a tangled web of noble bloodlines to back their claim. The most prominent were John Balliol and Robert Bruce, the grandfather of the future king. To avoid a bloody civil war, the Scottish nobles made a fatal error in judgment. They invited Edward I to arbitrate and choose the rightful king. Edward agreed, but at a terrible price. He marched his army to the Scottish border and demanded that every claimant and every noble in Scotland recognize him as the Lord Paramount, the feudal overlord of their entire kingdom. He was no longer acting as a neutral judge, but as a conqueror, asserting his ancient, if dubious, claim to Scotland. Trapped between Edward's army and the threat of internal chaos, the Scottish nobility buckled. They swore fealty to the English king. In 1292, Edward chose John Balliol to be the new King of Scots. He had chosen the weaker, more pliable man, someone he believed he could control. King John was systematically humiliated from the very beginning. Edward treated him not as a fellow monarch, but as a mere vassal. He undermined Balliol's authority, reversed his legal judgments, and demanded that Scottish soldiers and money be used to fund England's war against France. For the proud Scottish nobles and for the common people, this was an unbearable insult. The kingdom of Scotland was being dismantled piece by piece and absorbed into the English crown. By 1296, King John Balliol had had enough. He made a desperate stand, renouncing his fealty to Edward and signing a treaty with France, an alliance that would become known as the Auld Alliance. Edward's response was swift and merciless. He marched his army north and unleashed hell upon the border town of Berwick. In an act of shocking brutality, his soldiers sacked the town, slaughtering thousands of men, women, and children. The massacre sent a wave of terror across Scotland. The Scottish army, a traditional feudal host led by the same nobles who had sworn loyalty to Edward just a few years earlier, was crushed at the Battle of Dunbar. King John Balliol was captured, publicly stripped of his royal insignia, and forced to abdicate. Edward I marched through Scotland unopposed, seizing the Stone of Destiny, the ancient coronation stone of Scottish kings, and taking it back to Westminster as a symbol of his total conquest. He declared that Scotland was now without a king and would be ruled directly by him. English administrators and soldiers were installed across the country. The Scottish nobility was shattered, its leaders dead in exile or imprisoned. The nation was on its knees. It is in this crucible of defeat, humiliation, and simmering rage that our story truly begins. With the great lords defeated and the country occupied, it seemed that all hope was lost. But resistance didn't come from the castles and the halls of power. It came from the forests, the villages, and the hearts of ordinary people. It came from a man whose name was not yet known, a member of the lesser gentry, a second son with little land and no great title. His name was William Wallace. History is often frustratingly silent about the early lives of those who are not born into the highest echelons of power. So it is with William Wallace. He was a son of the gentry, the lower rung of the landed aristocracy. His father was Sir Malcolm Wallace, a minor knight and a vassal of the powerful Stuart family, one of the most influential noble houses in Scotland. This is a crucial distinction. As a member of this class, William Wallace would have been educated, likely trained from a young age in the arts of war, horsemanship, swordsmanship, and the tactics of medieval combat. He would have understood the language of law, politics, and feudal obligation. He was not an outsider to the system. He was a product of it. Furthermore, as a second son, his path in life was not preordained. His elder brother would inherit the family's modest lands and titles. William would have had to make his own way in the world. Men like him often sought careers as professional soldiers, churchmen, or administrators. This status gave him a degree of independence and perhaps a chip on his shoulder. He possessed the training of a knight without the vast lands and responsibilities that often made the higher nobility cautious and politically pragmatic. The most famous and detailed source for Wallace's life comes from a 15th century epic poem called The Wallace, written by a minstrel known as Blind Harry, nearly 200 years after Wallace's death. This work is both a blessing and a curse for historians. It is a masterpiece of storytelling, a passionate and patriotic epic that single-handedly preserved Wallace's memory and cemented his status as Scotland's national hero. However, it is also a work of historical fiction filled with legendary exploits, romantic embellishments, and fierce anti-English propaganda. Blind Harry's aim was not to write a dispassionate history, but to inspire a new generation of Scots by creating a larger-than-life hero. It is from his verses that we get the intimate details and personal motivations that have so defined Wallace's popular image. Blind Harry tells of Wallace being sent to be educated by his uncles, both priests who instilled in him a fervent love of liberty and a fluency in Latin. He paints a picture of a towering young man, incredibly strong, quick-witted, and with a temper that flared instantly at the sight of English arrogance. The poem is filled with tales of Wallace's early defiance. In one famous story, a young Wallace is fishing on the River Irvine when he is confronted by English soldiers who mock him and demand his catch. Wallace politely offers them a share, but they, embodying the greed of the occupation, want it all. An argument ensues, and Wallace, using his simple fishing rod as a makeshift weapon, kills several of them and escapes into the woods. In another tale, Wallace walks through the marketplace in the English garrison town of Lanark, where a soldier taunts him about his fine green cloak and the long sword he carries, a weapon forbidden to Scots. The taunts escalate into a brawl, which then explodes into a running battle through the streets as more soldiers join the fray. These stories, whether literally true or not, illustrate a deeper truth about the English occupation. It was not just a political reality decided in the halls of power. It was a daily series of humiliations, big and small, inflicted upon the Scottish people. English soldiers requisitioned food, demanded service, and treated the locals with contempt. It was this constant grinding oppression, this daily friction between occupier and occupied, that created the fertile ground for rebellion. The true spark that ignited Wallace's personal war, according to the legend immortalized by Blind Harry, was the most profound loss a man can suffer. The story centers on Marion Braidfute, a young woman Wallace had secretly married in the town of Lanark. To keep her safe from the unwanted attentions of the English garrison, their love was kept hidden. But the English sheriff of Lanark, William de Heselrig, a man portrayed as the epitome of English cruelty, discovered their connection. After an altercation with Wallace, Heselrig, in a cruel act of revenge, had Marion seized and executed. In a blind rage of grief and fury, Wallace gathered a small band of followers that very night. They scaled the walls of Lanark, stormed the sheriff's residence, and cornered Heselrig. Wallace, his heart broken and his soul burning for vengeance, hacked the sheriff to pieces with his own sword. This act, born of profound personal tragedy, was the point of no return. It transformed William Wallace from a disgruntled knight into a wanted outlaw and a rebel leader. News of his daring, bloody assault on an agent of the English king spread like wildfire. He had done what the great cowed nobles of Scotland had failed to do. He had struck back hard and without mercy. While the heart-wrenching story of Marion Braidfute is almost certainly a romantic invention of Blind Harry's, there is no contemporary record of her existence. The core event is not. The killing of William de Heselrig is a documented historical fact. In May 1297, Wallace and his men did indeed attack the English garrison at Lanark and kill its sheriff. This was no mere brawl. It was an act of open rebellion, a declaration of war against the English occupation. Suddenly, men from all walks of life began to flock to his banner. These were not the knights and lords of the defeated Scottish army. They were commoners, archers, small landowners, and burgesses from the towns, men who had lost everything and had nothing left to fear. Wallace became their champion, a man of their class who spoke their language of anger and defiance. At the very same time, in the north of Scotland, another separate uprising was taking root. This rebellion was led by Andrew Moray. A young nobleman with a pedigree as impressive as Wallace's was modest. Moray was the son and heir of Sir Andrew Moray of Petty, a powerful northern lord. Both his father and his uncle had been captured at the Battle of Dunbar and were languishing in English prisons. Unlike Wallace, who was fighting for an idea, Moray was a highborn son fighting a more traditional battle to reclaim his family's lands, restore their honor, and avenge their defeat. He was a skilled military commander who, after escaping from an English castle, raised his family's banners and rallied the northern lords to his cause. Throughout the spring and summer of 1297, Wallace and Moray, operating independently at first, waged brilliant parallel guerrilla campaigns that threw the English administration into chaos. In the south, Wallace's forces ambushed English patrols and supply convoys. His rebellion swept through central Scotland, and he led a successful assault on Scone, the ancient crowning place of Scottish kings, driving out the English justiciar. In the north, Moray was even more successful, systematically securing the entire country north of the River Tay. He drove the English out of Aberdeen and laid siege to key castles, including the formidable Urquhart Castle on the banks of Loch Ness. They were not fighting the traditional set-piece battles of the feudal era that had led to the disaster at Dunbar. They were using the terrain, the forests, the hills, the bogs, to their advantage, launching swift, brutal raids on English garrisons, then melting back into the landscape before the enemy could mount a response. By late summer, the English occupation was crumbling. The two rebel armies, having cleared their respective territories, converged. Wallace, the charismatic leader of the common man, and Moray, the strategic noble, joined forces near the town of Dundee. It was a pivotal moment. Together they represented a united Scotland, a fusion of highborn and lowborn commoner and aristocrat united in a single cause. They began issuing letters and proclamations not in their own names, but as commanders of the army of the Kingdom of Scotland, acting on behalf of the captive King John Balliol. They were no longer mere rebels. They were the de facto government of a liberated Scotland. With their forces combined, they marched their army south towards the strategically vital Stirling Castle, a fortress whose location on the River Forth controlled the main route between the north and south of Scotland. Whoever held Stirling held Scotland. The stage was set for a confrontation that would send a shockwave across Europe. The fusion of these two rebellions, one aristocratic, the other populist, created a unified national army for the first time since the disaster at Dunbar. The march on Stirling was a bold statement that the Scottish resistance was no longer a scattered collection of guerrilla raids, but a credible force capable of challenging English rule directly. The English, however, viewed this convergence with contempt. For them, it was merely a larger mob to be crushed, an undisciplined rabble led by a young, vengeful noble and a provincial knight. As the two armies converged on the vital crossing of the River Forth, the stage was set for a classic confrontation between imperial arrogance and a desperate, burning desire for freedom. The English governor in Scotland, John de Warenne, the 6th Earl of Surrey, was a veteran of Edward's Welsh campaigns and a man of immense power and experience. He was not, however, a man who held the Scots in high regard. Alongside him was the hated treasurer, Hugh de Cressingham, a portly and arrogant administrator who had enforced Edward's punishing taxes with relish. To them, the Scottish rebellion was an annoyance, an uprising of peasants and minor lords that needed to be stamped out. They commanded a massive professional English army of heavy cavalry, the armored shock troops of their day, seasoned Welsh longbowmen, and thousands of well-equipped infantry. Facing them, they believed, was a rabble. A Scottish army composed largely of foot soldiers, common men armed with little more than long spears, courage, and a burning hatred for the occupation. On paper, it was a laughable mismatch. Surrey was so confident of an easy victory that he delayed his advance for weeks, even sending some of his soldiers home to save money. He saw the Scots as an undisciplined mob that would break and run at the first thunderous charge of his knights. It was a fatal miscalculation born of arrogance and a profound underestimation of his enemy's leadership and resolve. He failed to understand that he was not facing a feudal host fighting for their lord's honor. He was facing the birth of a nation's army, fighting for its very soul. On the 11th of September, 1297, the two armies faced each other across the deep, muddy banks of the River Forth at Stirling. The only way for the English army to cross the river and engage the Scots was via a narrow wooden bridge, a structure so constricted that only 2 or 3 horsemen could ride across it abreast. It was a tactical bottleneck of epic proportions, a death trap waiting for an army to enter. The Scottish forces, under the joint command of Wallace and Moray, were waiting patiently, concealed on the high ground of the Abbey Craig, the very site where the Wallace Monument stands today. From this vantage point, they could watch every English move, their own position shielded from view. Surrey's Scottish advisers, nobles in his service, who understood the terrain and the tenacity of their countrymen, warned him of the extreme danger. They pointed to a nearby ford, just 2 miles upstream, where the river was wider and shallower. A large part of the army could cross there and outflank the Scottish position, trapping them between 2 forces. It was sound military advice, but the pompous Hugh de Cressingham, ever eager to crush the rebellion quickly and save the king's money on a prolonged campaign, dismissed their concerns with contempt. "Why should we prolong this business and spend the king's treasure?" he reportedly sneered. "Let us advance and do our duty as we are bound to do." His arrogance won the day, and so the English vanguard, glittering in their mail and steel, began its slow, ponderous march across the narrow wooden bridge. Wallace and Moray held their nerve. They had given strict orders. No man was to move until the signal was given. They waited. They watched as thousands of English and Welsh infantry, followed by the elite squadrons of heavy cavalry, streamed across the narrow causeway, creating a perfect condensed target on the marshy ground of the northern bank. The Scottish army remained silent, motionless on the hill. The tension must have been unbearable, a nation's fate hanging on a single moment of discipline and timing. Then, when perhaps half of the English force had crossed, enough to be a formidable army, but not enough to properly form ranks and deploy, the signal was given. A hunting horn blasted its defiant note across the valley. The Scots let out a terrifying unified roar and charged down the hill. A contingent of spearmen raced to seize the northern end of the bridge, a human wall of spear points that cut off the English advance and, more crucially, slammed the door on any possibility of retreat. The main body of the Scottish army then slammed with irresistible force into the English troops, who were trapped on the northern bank of the river, caught between the Scottish schiltrons and the unforgiving water. The result was not a battle, it was a slaughter. The heavily armored English knights, the most feared warriors in Christendom, were hemmed in, their powerful war horses useless in the boggy ground, their devastating charge completely negated. They were systematically butchered by the disciplined ranks of Scottish spearmen, fighting in tightly packed formations known as schiltrons, hedgehogs of 12-foot spears that were impenetrable to cavalry. English and Welsh soldiers who tried to flee back across the bridge were cut down in a panicked crush. Others, weighed down by their armor, were pushed into the river and drowned in the thick mud. The great English army, so confident just moments before, was thrown into utter chaos and panic. It was a maelstrom of terror, steel, and blood. The Earl of Surrey, who had foolishly remained on the south side of the river, watched in abject horror as his elite army was annihilated before his eyes. Realizing the day was lost, he ordered the bridge to be destroyed to prevent the Scots from pursuing him, and then fled ignominiously all the way back to the English border, abandoning his command, his army, and all of Scotland in his panicked flight. The victory at the Battle of Stirling Bridge was total, stunning, and almost unbelievable. It was a victory of strategy over brute force, of discipline, and patience over arrogance. It sent a shockwave across Europe. A so-called peasant army led by a minor knight and a young noble had utterly destroyed a professional English force. Hugh de Cressingham, the treasurer, who had so cruelly taxed the Scottish people and had insisted on the fatal crossing, was killed in the battle. According to the chronicles, the Scots' hatred for him was so intense that they flayed his body. Wallace himself was said to have had a sword belt made from a strip of his skin, a gruesome but powerfully symbolic testament to the raw fury the occupation had inspired. But the victory came at a terrible cost. Andrew Moray, the brilliant co-commander and the strategic mind of the Northern Rebellion, was severely wounded in the battle. He lingered for a few weeks but would die from his injuries in November. His loss was incalculable, but his contribution was immortal. William Wallace was left as the sole, undisputed leader of the Scottish Rebellion. In the aftermath of Stirling Bridge, almost all of Scotland was liberated. The remaining English garrisons were quickly mopped up or surrendered. In a solemn ceremony at the Kirk of the Forest in Selkirk, William Wallace was knighted, likely by a Scottish earl, and was proclaimed guardian of the Kingdom of Scotland, to rule in the name of the exiled King John Balliol. For a brief, glorious period, a second son of the gentry, a man with no great lands or title, was the de facto ruler of the country. He proved to be more than just a brilliant guerrilla commander. He was a surprisingly able and forward-thinking administrator. He set about restoring order, organizing the army, and trying to rebuild Scotland's shattered economy and international trade. In one of the few documents from this period that survives with his name on it, we see a glimpse of Wallace the statesman. It is a letter written in Latin and addressed to the merchants of Lubeck and Hamburg, two powerful trading cities in the Hanseatic League. In it, William Wallace, knight, guardian of the Kingdom of Scotland, and commander of its armies, informs them that their merchants could now safely trade with Scotland because the kingdom had been recovered by war from the power of the English. It was a clear signal to the world that Scotland was once again an independent nation, open for business. He even took the fight to England itself. In the winter of 1297, Wallace led his army across the border, harrying the northern English counties of Northumberland and Cumberland. This was not a campaign of conquest, but a brutal, punitive raid designed to feed his army from English stores and to show Edward I that Scotland was no longer a victim, but a force to be reckoned with. English chroniclers paint a horrific picture of this invasion, describing pillaging, burning and killing, claiming the Scots spared neither person nor holy place. To the English, Wallace was a bloodthirsty monster. To the Scots, he was a hero, taking a just and necessary revenge for the horrors of Berwick. But Wallace's golden moment was to be tragically short-lived. Far away, campaigning in Flanders, King Edward I heard the news of the unmitigated disaster at Stirling Bridge. His fury was immense. He immediately concluded a truce with the King of France and turned his full, undivided attention to crushing the Scottish rebellion once and for all. The hammer of the Scots was coming home, and he was coming for William Wallace. The stunning victory at Stirling Bridge was a brief, glorious dawn for a liberated Scotland. With Wallace as its guardian, the nation began to rebuild, to assert its independence on the world stage, and even to take the fight to the enemy's own soil. But this success, achieved against a regional governor and his complacent army, had awakened a sleeping giant. The news of the humiliation of his forces and the death of his treasurer reached King Edward I in Flanders, and his reaction was not one of mere anger, but of cold, calculated fury. The game was over. The rebellion that he had dismissed as a minor nuisance now commanded the full, undivided, and merciless attention of the most formidable military commander in Europe. The year 1298 brought with it the full and terrible might of the English war machine. King Edward I was not a man to be trifled with, nor was he one to repeat the mistakes of his subordinates. When he returned to England, he set about assembling a truly massive army, one of the largest ever seen in medieval Britain. This was not the arrogant, overconfident force that had been defeated at Stirling. This was an army led by the king himself, a veteran of countless campaigns, a master of logistics and strategy, burning with a cold, methodical desire for vengeance. The numbers were staggering for the time. Edward's host comprised over 2,000 knights and heavy cavalry, the armored fist of his kingdom, and more than 12,000 disciplined infantry. Crucially, this force included a huge contingent of his most feared weapon, the Welsh longbowmen. In his brutal conquest of Wales, Edward had witnessed the power of the longbow, a weapon that could outreach conventional bows and fire arrows, with enough force to pierce mail and light armor. He had incorporated thousands of Welsh archers into his army, perfecting tactics that would make English forces the terror of European battlefields for the next century. This was the army he was now leading north, a professional, balanced, and utterly ruthless force with a single objective: to find William Wallace and erase his rebellion from the face of the earth. Wallace, now the undisputed guardian of Scotland, knew he could not hope to defeat such a force in a conventional, open battle. His own army was much smaller, consisting mainly of the spearmen who had been so effective at Stirling Bridge, but lacking the cavalry and archers to counter Edward's combined arms force. Furthermore, the Scottish nobles, many of whom had only grudgingly accepted the leadership of a minor knight, were unreliable. They were jealous of his power, resentful of his popularity with the common folk, and privately terrified of Edward's wrath. A single defeat could shatter their fragile coalition. So Wallace adopted a brilliant and brutal strategy: scorched earth. As Edward's massive army marched north through the Scottish lowlands, they found a desolate and empty land. On Wallace's orders, the Scots had burned their own crops in the fields, moved their livestock into the remote hills, and withdrawn before the English advance. They refused to give the English king the pitched battle he craved. Instead, they would let the Scottish landscape and hunger itself defeat the invaders. The strategy began to work. Edward's massive army was a beast with a massive appetite, and its logistical supply line, consisting of lumbering wagon trains and coastal ships, struggled to keep up. The English soldiers marched through an empty, hostile country, their rations dwindling. The supply ships that Edward had arranged to meet them on the Firth of Forth were delayed by persistently bad weather. Morale plummeted. Food riots broke out in the English camp, and the Welsh infantry, starving and miserable, were on the brink of a full-scale mutiny. Edward, camped near Edinburgh, grew desperate. The campaign was failing. It seemed he would have no choice but to order a humiliating retreat back to England. It seemed Wallace's strategy of avoidance and attrition had won. And then came the betrayal. On the 21st of July, as Edward was preparing to give the order to fall back, two Scottish earls, Patrick of Dunbar and the Earl of Angus, rode into the English camp. These were powerful nobles who, while ostensibly part of the Scottish resistance, had always put their own survival and lands first. Seeing which way the wind was blowing, they chose to make their peace with the English king by giving him the one piece of information he needed. They revealed Wallace's location. The Scottish army was camped just 20 miles away in Callender Wood near Falkirk, preparing to harass the English retreat. Edward seized the opportunity. "God be praised," he reportedly exclaimed, "who has hitherto delivered me from every peril. They shall not need to follow me, for I will go to meet them this very day." All thoughts of retreat vanished. He immediately ordered his army to prepare to march. They rode through the night, a silent, ghostly column of steel, catching the Scots completely by surprise on the morning of July 22nd, 1298. Wallace was trapped. He had been outmaneuvered not by Edward, but by the treachery of his own countrymen. He had no choice but to stand and fight. He chose his ground as best he could, positioning his spearmen on a forward slope with a marshy bog to their front, hoping to impede the charge of the English knights. He arranged his spearmen, perhaps 5,000 strong, into four massive circular formations, the schiltrons. These were his hedgehogs of death, bristling with 12-foot long spears, virtually impenetrable to a cavalry charge. Between the schiltrons, he placed his small force of archers, commanded by his second-in-command, Sir John Stewart of Bonkill. His tiny contingent of cavalry, provided by the Scottish nobles, including the powerful Comyn and Bruce factions, was held in reserve. As the vast English army advanced across the field, Wallace is said to have given his men a simple, defiant encouragement. "I have brought you to the ring. Now dance if you can." The battle began with a thunderous charge from the English heavy cavalry. Just as Wallace had predicted, the schiltrons held firm. The English knights crashed against the dense forest of Scottish spears, unable to break the disciplined formations. Horses and men were impaled on the spear points, and the first wave of the attack was bloodily repulsed, falling back in disarray. For a moment, a fleeting, hopeful moment, it seemed that the miracle of Stirling Bridge might be repeated. But Falkirk was not Stirling, and King Edward was not the Earl of Surrey. He was a master tactician who learned from his mistakes. Seeing his elite knights fail, he calmly called them back and unleashed his secret weapon. He ordered his thousands of Welsh longbowmen to advance. They planted their bows and began to rain down a terrifying and relentless storm of arrows on the static Scottish schiltrons. It was a death sentence. The Scottish spearmen, packed tightly together for defense against cavalry, were completely exposed and had no answer to the deadly volleys. The arrows fell like hail, a high arcing steel storm that pierced leather jerkins and found gaps in chainmail. The schiltrons could do nothing but stand and die, their long spears useless against an enemy they couldn't reach. The ground around them became littered with the dead and dying. It was at this critical moment that the final betrayal occurred. The Scottish cavalry, led by the nobles, the very men whose duty it was to charge the vulnerable English archers and disperse them, simply turned and fled the field without striking a single blow. Whether it was an act of deliberate treachery by nobles who wanted to see the upstart Wallace fall, or simple cowardice in the face of the overwhelming English numbers, the result was the same. The Scottish archers under Sir John Stuart stood their ground and were cut to pieces. The spearmen in the schiltrons were left to be slaughtered from a distance. Under the unceasing hail of arrows, the steadfast schiltrons began to waver and break. Gaps, torn open by the endless volleys, appeared in the rings of spears. Edward saw his chance and ordered his knights to charge again. This time, they crashed through the weakened, bleeding formations. The battle turned into a massacre. The once impenetrable hedgehogs of spears were shattered, and the English knights rode through them, cutting down the survivors. The Scottish army, which had stood so defiantly just an hour before, ceased to exist. Thousands were killed. Wallace himself, fighting in the heart of the carnage, managed to escape the field, melting away into the woods with a small band of his most loyal followers. The Battle of Falkirk was a catastrophic and total defeat. In a single bloody afternoon, everything that had been gained at Stirling Bridge was lost. The dream of a free Scotland, which had burned so brightly just a year before, was drowned in blood on the fields of Falkirk. Wallace's reputation as an invincible warrior was shattered. His army was gone. In the aftermath of the disaster, consumed by the shame of the defeat and the sting of betrayal, he resigned as guardian of Scotland. The leadership of the resistance passed to two powerful nobles who had survived the battle: Robert the Bruce, the grandson of the claimant, and John Comyn, Wallace's great rival. William Wallace, the hero of Stirling Bridge, the guardian of Scotland, was once again a fugitive and an outlaw. His brief, glorious year of power was over, his cause apparently in ruins. In a single bloody afternoon, the dream that had been forged at Stirling Bridge was shattered on the fields of Falkirk. The defeat was more than just a military catastrophe. It was a political and psychological blow that broke the back of the national movement Wallace had built. His aura of invincibility was gone, and the fragile unity of the Scottish cause fractured under the weight of failure and betrayal. For Wallace, the fall was absolute. Stripped of his authority and his army, he was once again an outlaw. But while the leadership of the war passed to others, his personal fight for Scotland was far from over. It would simply take a new, more desperate form. William Wallace, the hero of Scotland, once again became a fugitive. The catastrophic defeat at Falkirk stripped him of more than just his army. It stripped him of his authority. In the dark days that followed, filled with recrimination and the bitter sting of noble betrayal, he resigned his position as guardian of the kingdom. The great lords, who had long chafed under the command of a man they considered an upstart, were quick to reassert control. The leadership of the battered but not yet broken resistance passed to two of the most powerful men in Scotland, Robert the Bruce, Earl of Carrick, the grandson of the original claimant, and John Comyn, Lord of Badenoch, often called the Red Comyn. The war continued, but its character changed. Under Bruce and Comyn, a bitter rivalry that constantly simmered beneath the surface, the fight became a more conventional aristocratic struggle. They were skilled commanders, but they lacked Wallace's unique ability to inspire the common man and unite the nation in a single fiery cause. Their war was one of strategic maneuvering and the seizing of castles, often driven as much by the preservation of their own lands and power as by a pure, uncompromising ideal of national freedom. Wallace, the man who had embodied that ideal, now moved in the shadows, a ghost in his own land. But he did not give up the fight. Instead, he embarked on a new, desperate mission, one that required not a sword, but a diplomat's tongue and a patriot's conviction. Sometime in late 1299, he vanished from Scotland altogether. He had gone undercover, traveling to the continent on a perilous quest to save his country through international politics. This period of his life reveals a different side of Wallace, proving he was not just a warrior, but a shrewd and relentless advocate for his nation's cause. His primary destination was the court of King Philip IV of France. He carried with him letters of safe conduct and introduction, likely from the Scottish leadership, addressed to the French king. His hope was to invoke the Auld Alliance, the treaty that King John Balliol had signed with France just before his downfall. He aimed to persuade King Philip to put direct pressure on Edward to recognize Scottish independence, or better yet, to intervene militarily. He became a thorn in Edward's side, a rogue ambassador for a vanquished kingdom. His very presence in the courts of Europe, a defiant reminder that the Scottish problem had not been solved at Falkirk. Edward was so incensed by Wallace's activities that he wrote to the French king, demanding that the enemy of my kingdom be handed over to him. For a time, Wallace's mission seemed to bear fruit. Philip IV offered him support and refused to extradite him. Wallace may have even traveled on from France to Rome to plead Scotland's case directly to Pope Boniface VIII, the one man in Christendom whose moral authority might have swayed the English king. But Wallace was playing a high-stakes game against a master of European politics. The great kings of Europe were pragmatists, and the fate of a small northern kingdom was a minor pawn in their grand chessboard. Ultimately, King Philip of France made peace with Edward I, a peace sealed by a marriage alliance. The Pope, under intense English pressure, issued a papal bull that effectively condemned the Scottish resistance. Wallace's diplomatic mission had failed. The political realities of power had triumphed over the moral case for freedom. Around 1303, he returned secretly to Scotland. The country he came back to was once again on its knees, in a state far worse than when he had left. In his absence, Edward I had been relentless. He had launched a series of massive, devastating campaigns, methodically crushing the last pockets of resistance. He had marched his armies to the very northernmost tip of Scotland, conquering and garrisoning castles as he went. Most of the Scottish nobles, their lands ravaged and their resources exhausted, had finally submitted. In a crushing blow to the patriotic cause, even Robert the Bruce had made his peace with the English king in 1302. The last bastion of organized national resistance, the mighty Stirling Castle, fell in 1304 after a spectacular and brutal siege. Edward, taking personal command, brought forth a fearsome array of siege engines, including a giant trebuchet he had custom-built for the occasion, nicknamed the War Wolf. Its massive projectiles relentlessly pounded the castle walls into rubble until the starving garrison had no choice but to surrender. The fall of Stirling was the symbolic end of the war. With Scotland now firmly under his heel, Edward set about creating a new administration for the conquered territory, an ordinance he called the Settlement of Scotland. He offered a general pardon in surprisingly lenient terms to almost all the Scottish leaders who had fought against him, including John Comyn. He was willing to be magnanimous in victory, to bring the Scottish nobles back into the fold, but his clemency had one stark exception. The ordinance listed all the Scottish leaders and their punishments, ending with the chilling words, "As for William Wallace, it is agreed that he shall render himself up at the will and mercy of our sovereign lord the king." For William Wallace there would be no pardon, there would be no terms. He was declared a public enemy, a permanent outlaw to be hunted down and killed by anyone who could find him. A huge price was put on his head. Edward's obsession with capturing Wallace had become personal. He saw Wallace not just as an enemy combatant, but as a personal affront. A commoner who had dared to defy a king, who had slaughtered his armies, and who had refused to ever acknowledge his authority. The conquest of Scotland would not be complete until Wallace was in chains. For months, Wallace lived as a fugitive, returning to the life he had known at the very beginning of his rebellion. He led a small guerrilla band in the hills and forests around Glasgow, a lonely symbol of defiance in a land that had otherwise surrendered. He was the last man standing, the final flicker of a fire that had once raged across the nation, but his days were numbered. The end came on August 5th, 1305, at Robroyston, a small village near Glasgow. He was not captured in a heroic last stand, but through betrayal. A Scottish knight in the service of the English, Sir John de Menteith, the governor of Dumbarton Castle, was the architect of his capture. Menteith was given information on Wallace's whereabouts by one of Wallace's own men, a servant named Jack Short. Acting on this intelligence, Menteith and his soldiers surrounded the house where Wallace was sleeping and took him captive. The man who had been the guardian of Scotland, who had humbled the armies of England and held the fate of his nation in his hands, was finally in chains. He was paraded south to London, a journey of over 400 miles, displayed in towns and villages along the way as a trophy of war. He was destined for a show trial in Westminster Hall and a horrific preordained death. King Edward would finally have his revenge. After years as a fugitive, a diplomat, and a lonely guerrilla fighter, the hunt for William Wallace was finally over. His capture represented the final symbolic nail in the coffin of the First War of Independence. For King Edward, this was not merely the capture of a rebel, it was the capture of an idea, the very embodiment of Scottish defiance. The long journey to London was a victory parade, designed to show the world that the will of the Scottish people was now personified in one chained man. The final act of this long and bloody drama would not take place on a battlefield, but in the heart of English power, where law would be used as the ultimate weapon of vengeance. The trial of William Wallace, if one can even call it that, was a piece of pure political theater. On August 23, 1305, he was brought to Westminster Hall, the great heart of English government and law. He was not there for justice, but for judgment. Chained and haggard from his long journey south, he was put on public display, a chained beast to be gawked at by the London crowds. To complete the spectacle of humiliation, a crown woven of laurel leaves was mockingly placed on his head, a sarcastic tribute to his supposed ambition to be King of Scotland, an ambition he had never held, having fought always in the name of the exiled King John. A panel of English judges presided as the charges against him were read out: treason against King Edward, murder of English subjects, and sacrilege for burning churches during his campaigns. Wallace was not allowed to speak in his own defense, nor was he permitted any legal counsel. The proceedings were a formality, a public reading of a verdict that had been decided the moment of his capture. But when the Chief Justice accused him of treason, Wallace was finally able to shout his defiance, his voice ringing through the great hall. He admitted to the killings, he admitted to the burnings, he admitted to being an enemy of the English king and his people. But treason? Never. I could not be a traitor to Edward, he declared, his words a simple, powerful statement of truth, for I was never his subject. He was a Scot, born in a sovereign kingdom that had existed for centuries. He owed no allegiance to the King of England. His only crime was patriotism. But his words fell on deaf ears. The verdict was a foregone conclusion. He was found guilty on all counts and sentenced to a traitor's death in its most barbaric and terrifying form. His execution that same day at Smithfield was the meticulously staged event that began our story. Every part of the ritual was laden with symbolic meaning, a final brutal lesson from the English state. He was dragged for miles behind a horse because he had been disloyal. He was hanged, but cut down alive for the robberies and crimes he had committed against the king's subjects. He was disemboweled while still conscious. His entrails burned before him because he had supposedly committed sacrilege by desecrating churches during his northern campaigns. His head was cut off and his body quartered because he had committed the ultimate crime of treason against the king. His head was dipped in tar to preserve it and then placed on a spike on London Bridge, a grisly warning to all who entered the city. His 4 limbs were sent to the 4 corners of his own country, one to Newcastle upon Tyne, then held by England but on the Scottish border, one to Berwick, one to Stirling, and one to Perth, a gruesome map of Edward's total dominion over the land Wallace had fought to free. King Edward I believed he had won. He had not only killed the man, but he had symbolically erased him, scattering his body to the winds. He had made an example so horrific that surely no Scot would ever dare to rise up again. The flame of Scottish resistance, which had flickered for so long, had finally been extinguished. He could not have been more wrong. The public, ritualistic execution of William Wallace did not terrify the Scots into submission. It galvanized them. The sheer, calculated cruelty of his death created a martyr. It demonstrated to every Scot, noble and commoner alike, that there could be no compromise with Edward. His goal was not just overlordship, it was the complete annihilation of their identity as a people. If this was the fate of their greatest champion, what mercy could any of them expect? Within 6 short months of Wallace's death, Robert the Bruce, the same man who had submitted to Edward and vied with John Comyn for power, made his decisive move. In February 1306, he arranged a meeting with his great rival, the Red Comyn, in the Church of the Grey Friars in Dumfries. The 2 men argued, and the confrontation turned violent. Bruce drew a dagger and stabbed Comyn before the high altar. Rushing from the church, he told his followers, "I doubt I have slain the Red Comyn." One of his men, Sir Roger de Kirkpatrick, famously replied, "I'll make sicker, I'll make sure," and went back inside to finish the job. This act of murder and sacrilege was the ultimate point of no return. Bruce had made an enemy of the powerful Comyn family and had been excommunicated by the Pope. His only path forward was to seize the crown. Just a few weeks later, he was crowned King of Scots at Scone, rekindling the wars of independence. It's one of history's great ironies. Wallace, the man who fought so fiercely in the name of the absent King John Balliol, and who was often at odds with the ambitious Bruce family, ended up paving the way for King Robert the Bruce. Wallace had been the firebrand, the uncompromising idealist. He had shown that England could be beaten. He had kept the spirit of resistance alive during the darkest of times, when all the great lords had failed or submitted. Bruce was the pragmatist, the politician, the king who would ultimately finish what Wallace had started. Bruce learned from Wallace's mistakes at Falkirk. He understood that he could not rely solely on schiltrons. He learned to use terrain, to choose his ground, and to integrate archers and cavalry into his strategy. And in 1314, 9 years after Wallace's death, King Robert the Bruce led the Scottish army to a decisive nation-defining victory over a massive English army at the Battle of Bannockburn. It was a victory that finally secured Scotland's independence for the next 400 years. While Wallace was not there to see it, his spirit hung heavy over that battlefield. The men fighting there were fighting for the same cause for which he had been so brutally martyred. For centuries after his death, Wallace remained a potent figure in Scotland. his story kept alive by Blind Harry's epic poem and by popular folklore. But it was the 1995 film Braveheart that catapulted him from a figure of national pride to a global icon. While a magnificent piece of cinema, thrilling and emotionally powerful, the film is also a work of historical fiction that plays fast and loose with the facts. Wallace was not a commoner, he was a knight. The Scots of his era did not wear kilts or paint their faces with blue woad, and the romantic subplot where Wallace has an affair with Princess Isabella of France is a complete fabrication. At the time of the Battle of Falkirk, the historical Isabella was 3 years old and living in France. Does any of this matter? To a historian, yes, but in a broader sense, perhaps not. The film was never intended to be a documentary. It was a historical epic designed to capture the spirit of Wallace's story, the themes of liberty, sacrifice, and defiance against tyranny. And in this, it succeeded beyond all measure, energizing the movement for greater Scottish autonomy and culminating in the successful 1997 referendum that established a new Scottish Parliament for the first time in nearly 300 years. The man who had been dead for almost 7 centuries was once again shaping the political destiny of his nation. So who was the real William Wallace? He was a man of his time, a member of the minor gentry who, through a combination of personal tragedy, profound patriotism, and sheer force of will, rose to lead a nation when its natural leaders had failed. He was a brilliant tactician but a flawed strategist, a charismatic leader who could inspire common men to die for him, but could never win the full trust of a nobility that saw him as an upstart. His true significance lies not in the battles he won or lost, but in the idea he represented. Before Wallace, resistance to Edward was largely about restoring the old feudal order. Wallace changed the nature of the war. He made it a national struggle, a popular war of liberation. He was the embodiment of the idea that Scotland belonged to the Scottish people, not to a distant English king, or even to its own squabbling nobles. In the end, we return to that scaffold in London. We see a man stripped of everything, his dignity, his strength, and finally, his life. Edward thought he was destroying an enemy, but he was forging a martyr. He thought he was sending a message of terror, but he sent a message of inspiration that would echo for 700 years. The true tragedy of William Wallace is that he never got to see the nation he dreamed of. He was the seed that had to fall into the ground and die for the tree of liberty to grow. His legacy is not written in the list of battles he won, but in the existence of the nation he helped to save. He was the uncrowned warrior, the guardian, who held the soul of his nation in his hands for one brief heroic year. He was betrayed, he was defeated, and he was brutally executed. But he was never broken, and in his defiant death he gave his country a story, a hero, and a single, immortal word that would define its past and shape its future: freedom.